Greetings, everyone. I'm Kyle Pierce, and as we kick off what will be just over a year of Jupiter in the tropical sign of Taurus between May 16th, 2023 and May 25th, 2024, I wanted to take some time to go over the meaning of Jupiter in the sign of Taurus. Wherever Jupiter is placed within the sky at any given time or within a birth chart, Jupiter will tend to want to open doors, create opportunities, impart wisdom, and assist in expanding your worldview, your bank account, if possible, and generally have a positive influence. So we're going to take some time to thoroughly examine Jupiter in Taurus, its general meaning, so that you can apply it to interpreting it in your birth chart if you have a Jupiter in Taurus, if you are a Jupiter in Taurus native, or apply it to whatever house in your birth chart Jupiter is transiting through for the next year. So if that sounds like something you want to know more about, stick around. And while you're at it, like the video, subscribe, be like Jupiter, and help this channel grow and expand, and share the good news of the wisdom you've acquired today. But to get an understanding of how Jupiter is going to tend to operate in Taurus, we want to establish, what is the relationship that Jupiter generally has with Taurus. Taurus is a fixed Earth sign. It's ruled by Venus, and it is the exaltation of the moon. So Taurus tends to support endeavors of a Venusian and lunar nature, such as art, right? Enjoyable experiences like tasty food, the appreciation of the material world, the beauty that lies within it, as well as the bounty that it has to offer, which we can use to enrich our lives, make them more enjoyable, and have more to share with the people that we care about most, right? So that doesn't seem, antithetical to Jupiter, right? Seems like there's a bit, at least, for Jupiter to get down with in Taurus, and there is. But I want to take a look at just generally what Jupiter's relationship with Earth signs are. We consider Jupiter and just the signs that it rules. It rules Sagittarius, which is a mutable fire sign. And it rules Pisces, a mutable water sign. And it has its exaltation in the sign of Cancer. It's a cardinal water sign. And then because Jupiter is a diurnal planet, a daytime planet, it's on the day team, works the day shift. It is assigned a certain kind of rulership or level of power and authority within diurnal signs, daytime signs, which would be the fire and air signs. It's a type of rulership called a triplicity rulership, sort of a shared rulership between planets, according to one of the four elements. So we know Jupiter likes fire, Jupiter likes air. Jupiter likes at least two of the water signs, likes Pisces, likes Cancer, and doesn't have a particular beef with Scorpio, right? It's there. It can be there without too much trouble, right? However, when we get to the Earth triplicity, the three Earth signs, Virgo, Capricorn, and Taurus, we see that Jupiter has a bit of a rough track record, maybe, with the Earth triplicity. In Virgo, the mutable Earth sign, Jupiter finds its detriment. It tends to struggle in Virgo, where we are assessing and calculating and categorizing Earth things, material things of the world, substance of the world, things you can see and feel, touch, pick up and carry over and give to a friend or hit someone in the face with. In Capricorn, Jupiter is in the sign of its fall, and we're trying to initiate things in the cold, dry sign of Capricorn. And when you're dealing with earthly materials, right, you're inherently have to work against gravity. Gravity always threatens to bring down our physical structures, and all physical things are subject to entropy. And while Jupiter likes to build things, right, it likes to bring coherence and stability to wherever it is, to whatever it's doing. All the effort and limitations that we're dealing with in Capricorn tends to be a bit of a downer for Jupiter. Tends to encounter disappointment when the high expectations, ambition, and optimism of Jupiter encounter the cold, hard grind of of Capricorn. However, in Taurus, the fixed Earth sign of the zodiac, our attention within the earthly plane is focused on what is beautiful and pleasurable about the substance of the earth. How do we bring ourselves into harmonious relationship with the earth and cultivate it so that it yields things which, sustain life, support life, and make life more beautiful, enjoyable, pleasurable, tasty things. So Jupiter likes to grow things, right? You don't see, glaring dissonance there. Venus is a benefic planet. Jupiter's a benefic planet. You can even see a sort of relationship between Venus having its exaltation in the sign of Pisces, which is ruled by Jupiter, and then Jupiter having its exaltation in the sign of Cancer, which is ruled by the moon. Both of those planets like it a lot in Taurus. However, if we're looking at things from a essential dignity perspective, we don't find that Jupiter enjoys the same, delights as much in the idyllic garden of Taurus. The earthly plane of existence is just a little bit too profane for Jupiter's tastes, you could say. Nonetheless, Jupiter, wherever it goes, is going to try to be helpful. It's going to try to do Jupiter things to, the best of his ability. And one way that, I kind of like to think about Jupiter and Taurus is I like to think about Gandalf, the Grey, the wizard, right, from Lord of the Rings, in the Shire, the land of the hobbits, right? The Shire might be the most Taurian place anyone ever dreamed up, where the inhabitants are peaceful, they're sort of engaged in an ongoing celebration of life. They love their home. Their home is beautiful, abundant, and they all love food. They love to eat. They have many meals every day. And when Gandalf shows up to the Shire, he's, well received, right? For the most part. He doesn't have like a job at the Shire per se. The Shire folk don't necessarily need Gandalf around. But Gandalf shows up. He has some delightful stories to tell. He can dazzle them with his wizardry. And he generally appreciates the peace-loving, joyful ways of the Shire folk, of the hobbits. He even has special relationships with some of the hobbits. The Baggins, right? He's, bros with Bilbo Baggins, as well as Frodo Baggins. But, some of the hobbits might be a little freaked out by what Gandalf is doing, right? To some of the hobbits, this strange, oversized outsider, Gandalf is potentially a bad influence, right? Or might be bringing with him ideas or telling the simple, common Shire folk stories of adventure outside that might lead them astray, right? Hobbits don't tend to want to leave the Shire. It's a bit of how Jupiter is can be a little out of place in Taurus. Not necessarily unwelcome, but he's sort of a novelty to the Shire folk, right? His powers are not especially useful to the Shire folk, but he does represent a sort of connection to larger events in the world that the Shire folk, for the most part, don't mind and some even enjoy. And, every now and then, Jupiter or Gandalf might have a quest for one of the simple Shire folk. It may well require them to leave home and abandon the simple pleasures of daily existence in the Shire. I think Frodo initially kind of doesn't want to go necessarily. He likes Gandalf's stories, but the task he's sort of delivering to Frodo is a bit too consequential, a bit too grand in scope, right? A bit too outside of the comfort zone, which is something you might see when Jupiter arrives in Taurus. Or one of the themes that you might encounter if you have Jupiter in Taurus natally is Jupiter is sort of potentially bringing in something that is outside of the Shire folks' comfort zone. So Jupiter in Taurus might describe perhaps being offered an opportunity that is a little bit outside of the comfort zone, or that can be part of what maybe limits the beneficence of Jupiter, as the sort of opportunities being offered, you might turn them down because, that seems uncomfortable, or, I'd have to leave all these familiar things that I enjoy so much. It can maybe generally describe the sort of tension that exists between those two impulses. You may find yourself on either side of that dynamic. Maybe you're the Jupiter, you're the Gandalf with the big quest that you have to convince maybe an unwilling or reluctant potential quester to go on. Maybe delivering something that's a little bit outside the scope of what the bulk of Taurus wants to do. So, you either have to be a little more creative about it as the wizard, as the Jupiter, or you're just not necessarily going to have an easy time influencing, the entire populace of the Shire. Maybe you can only get a few on board. Now, it's not to emphasize too much the limitations that Jupiter has in Taurus. They're there, but they're not, everything about the placement or about the transit. The reason that I want to at least get us on our first foot, maybe with Jupiter and Taurus, and its relationship with the sign, is to get a sense of, what we can expect in terms of results. When Jupiter shows up in Sagittarius, it's firing on all cylinders, right? The people, if you will, of Sagittarius want to be galvanized, inspired by, a lofty quest or a higher ideal. They want to be moved to rally, their disparate peoples, reconcile their internal divisions, and direct their efforts towards, the greater good, the big purpose, the big idea, the big vision. Jupiter is a sky god, right? It works through, the mode of fire or the mode of air more readily, through ideas, through passion and movement, enthusiasm. So where in Sagittarius, Jupiter can move fast, sort of bringing in all the mutable fire, summoning the fire spell so that it can, Hadouken at whatever it wants to. In Taurus, it doesn't quite get to do things like that. The material of Taurus is slower, right? It is like the cultivation of the land, where there's a process, there's an assessment of, what is the nature of the land, what are its properties, what is its capacity, what is its potential, which Jupiter is good at identifying potential, but doesn't necessarily want to do all the work. Jupiter's a planet associated with a certain degree of privilege, right? All the wisdom that Jupiter has to offer, has acquired, its education, its resources, the ability to open doors, or the having access to opportunity, right? Those are things that happen when you are in a position in society where you have privilege, right? You're elevated like fire or air above the earth. Now, Taurus is not a sign that's not without privilege, right? It's focused on the more enjoyable components of earth. It's having a big ass estate, right? That has maybe been developed and cultivated and worked on for years and years. And it's optimized and perfectly tuned to the land so that it delivers, fucking awesome grapes or apples or peaches or insert here, tasty things that you can enjoy and maybe sell for a profit. But that sort of abundance takes time to cultivate. And it probably takes a bit of work as well. You got to get your hands dirty. Jupiter is more of that thinking class, or that teaching class, or that ruling class. The people in society that historically, weren't doing farming, weren't plowing the fields, the sort of living on the surplus and being the maybe guiding influence on the masses. Making sure they are protected, making sure they're living wisely, they have access to wisdom, so that society continues to function in a cohesive, stable way, and so that it can grow and continue to expand and create more opportunities for people within that society. Jupiter and Taurus might be able to get down on some of that process, but it has to focus more on the material factors of things. If you're Gandalf in the Shire, and maybe you've taken up residence in the Shire, and you want to get something done there, you're going to have to meet the Shire folk on their terms, motivate them with things that the Shire folk like festivals at different times of the year, and tasty treats, and, reasonable spectacles. It'll be harder to convince them to restructure their society in a way that makes them a major producer of weapons in order to go fight the orcs, right? You got to work with the material that's available. Now, you can imagine that would be a bit of a process, right, for Gandalf or for a wizard showing up to the Shire. Jupiter has to like adjust to the pace of Taurus to some degree and meet it where it's at. And that's what you tend to see just in historical themes with Jupiter and Taurus. Is you don't get that many, big world-shattering events described by Jupiter and Taurus. You get a lot of helpful, supportive influence, sort of general tweaks and improvements that sort of optimize the Taurian sphere. And not that I want to sit and talk about food forever with Taurus, because there's a lot more to Taurus than food. However, you do see advances in food production when Jupiter is in Taurus. You get like the first Piggly Wiggly was a Jupiter and Taurus event. It was the first supermarket, right? Which may not seem earth-shattering. However, access to supermarkets currently, and the lack of access to supermarkets is an issue in a lot of urban areas, where it's more difficult to acquire affordable, fresh produce or more affordable and healthy food, which it generally negatively impacts the quality of life of the people, the inhabitants, and affects, the outcomes and opportunities available to them in a subtler but more fundamental way. And that's something to focus on with Jupiter and Taurus. It tends to deliver its abundance or deliver its opportunities and bounty through subtler but more fundamental ways. And food is just one of them, but a relevant one. Don't underestimate it. If over the next year you get introduced to a new diet plan or a health food store opens up nearby, it gives you access to affordable, healthier food, right? While that may not change your life immediately in a big way, you feeling better, you being healthier makes you more productive, more available to respond to opportunities as they come up, cuts back on medical expenses in the long run, and just improves your quality of life, right? So don't underestimate those gifts. Food production has been a really pivotal point of human advancement, throughout history. Take it back to, prehistory, and just learning how to cook food, the addition of fire to meat, to grains and vegetables, essentially unlocked the nutritional potential hidden within food, or unlocked more of it, and made it easier to digest. Did a lot of the work of breaking down complex proteins and fats and such, so that we could digest it easier, which freed up time, otherwise spent chewing or gathering food to do other things, to engage in higher endeavors, like building Stonehenge or something. It's also theorized that is that sort of pivotal advancement is what fed the growth of the human brain. So we not only had more time available, but our brains got bigger, were more well-fed and nourished. So we were able to eventually come up with stuff like agriculture, more complex systems of extracting food from the soil, from the earth, that were more efficient and allowed us to create more permanent settlements, but also resulted in a surplus of food, ideally, that supported, basically allowed some people to spend their lives making stuff or coming up with ideas or inventing things or creating rules for other people or creating ideas about, making life more meaningful, creating art that made life more beautiful. There's a general theme around making resources more accessible to people, more affordable whenever Jupiter is in Taurus. Things like canned food, right? Or even processed food. While, we don't necessarily love them for health reasons or, some of the ingredients that are added, aren't our favorite, may have negative health outcomes, but they also make it possible to feed people on a massive scale. As much as I love organic food and try to get it as much as possible, the reality of it is that we can't actually we don't have the capacity to sustainably feed everybody in the world organic produce, grain-fed chicken and cows, which is, a big problem, right? But, in that context, things like genetically modified organisms, foods, right, which I know is a controversial topic. I'm sure it's going to become relevant over the next year or so, or more relevant. But, theoretically, if done right, it makes it possible to feed people on the level that we need to be able to feed people. Now, while I haven't found a direct link between Jupiter and Taurus and genetically modified organisms, canned food, which was pretty groundbreaking in terms of making it possible to preserve food and distribute it over longer distances to more diverse populations. The patent for canned food was granted to Peter Durand in 1810 when Jupiter was in Taurus. So right at the end. We've already mentioned sliced bread was sold for the first time. It was in 1928 when Jupiter was in Taurus. Did get the first Piggly Wiggly. I also mentioned that. First supermarket. You also get the first Dairy Queen, which I believe is like 1940, 41 when Jupiter was in Taurus, as well as the first KFC in 1952, Jupiter and Taurus, which, may not be descriptive of the quality that Jupiter and Taurus might make available, but Dairy Queen is actually pretty good. Actually pretty good burgers and stuff. But, it's the making accessible, tasty things, right? Food that not necessarily or not only nourishes the body, or maybe doesn't necessarily nourish the body, but maybe nourishes the soul, right? Everything in moderation, of course. But you also get themes around the idea of like sustainability, maintaining sustainable relationship with the land, with food production. Certainly a topic that Jupiter and the sign of Taurus generally can jive on. You get the establishment of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for example. I believe that was in 1928. So again, maybe not the sexiest, most groundbreaking forms of making the world a better place for everybody. However, these are things that are needed in the world as a whole. So I'm hoping to see, some measures taken to promote, maybe some more sustainable agricultural practices. We've got big soil erosion problems, and perhaps some, interesting inventions. We do have Uranus and Taurus. I haven't looked closely at the last time Uranus was in Taurus, but I believe it may have been in Taurus in 1928. Don't quote me on that, but especially once the North Node gets out of Taurus, which will be in the next month or two, you should get a bit more of that injection of some sober, sustainable Jupiter and Taurus to hopefully improve the conditions of food production and distribution. But I can tell you there's a lot more to Jupiter and Taurus than just food, right? It's actually a pretty small part of what Jupiter and Taurus often delivers. Definitely a strong theme around general social improvements around labor, like workers' rights. The sort of Taurus ideal is this stable, sustainable, like rhythmic harmony between, work and life, that work-life balance. Jupiter can lend quite a bit of wisdom and introduce some coherence and opportunities to create more of a coherent relationship with that. I think collectively we're in a pretty unbalanced place when it comes to work and life, especially speaking for myself at least, with Uranus and the North Node in Taurus for the last year and a half together. Not particularly conducive to stable or sustainable relationships with this idea of work-life balance. But there's a long track record with Jupiter and Taurus. You get child labor laws in the United States, as well as workmen's compensation was established in 1916. Jupiter was in Taurus. In 1917, when Jupiter was still in Taurus, Supreme Court upheld 8-hour workday for railroad employees, which set a precedent for the kind of model of the 8-hour work week. Around the same time, you had Congress passing the first excess profits tax on corporations. Just maybe not as directly associated to labor, but this at least attempt or measure to introduce some coherence to the distribution of wealth, to maybe curtail some of the greed that can exist in Taurus, which Jupiter can fall prey to in certain circumstances. But generally, Jupiter brings a moralizing perspective to wherever it is. and wants to bring things back towards the middle a little more. While you can't really ignore the fact that Jupiter is in general supportive of something of a hierarchy, right? It's not inherently trying to create a total equanimity between all people, right? I think Jupiter's by and large fine with hierarchy as long as it's coherent and it supports everybody within that system. Venus is a little more interested in equanimity, right? And Jupiter is at Venus's disposal, so he has to play by Venus's rules a little bit. So you can see how maybe some of the policy that gets introduced is going to at least try to steer things in that direction, which I think at least some of us can agree is a needed thing. Not that I'm trying to create a political debate in the comments or anything, but you also get 1940, when Jupiter was in Taurus, the Fair Labor Standards that were established in 1938, which is before Jupiter in Taurus. Might have been Jupiter in Pisces, but that actually comes into effect, and with it, minimum wage was implemented, and a 44-hour work week was kind of established as the standard. And that's something you'll see with Jupiter and Taurus, is it's not always operating in the, creating the big thing on its own in the moment, in that time, but sort of functioning as a bit of a bridge between bigger moments, maybe in history, sort of maybe between Jupiter being really powerful in Pisces and Jupiter being really strong in Cancer, right? You get Jupiter and Taurus, sort of connecting the dots, or maybe connecting the policy, supporting things that were initiated before, carrying them through, which is definitely a quality that Jupiter seems to bring in Taurus when it comes to women's rights, civil rights. A lot of progress made historically when Jupiter's in Taurus. In fact, in 1916, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States. I do think you'd have to look at that as a bit of a collaborative effort between Jupiter and Saturn. Saturn was in Cancer at the time, which is, the sign of Jupiter's exaltation. It's Jupiter having like a positive influence on Saturn and adding a level of empowerment, empowering women to say no, or to create boundaries and structure around their uteruses, right? The Cancer parts. It's often when you're just dealing with just Jupiter, it's not going to necessarily do things that are going to be inhibitory in particular without some collaboration with Saturn. This is where, Saturn and Jupiter balance each other out. Too much Jupiter, too much unchecked growth, right? And things get out of control. Too much Saturn, not enough growth. Interestingly, though, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was arrested for obscenity advocating for birth control, which at the time was obscenity, right? The day after Jupiter retrograded back into Aries, right? It's not to laugh at like what it would be it's a serious thing, right? But it sort of tells you a lot about maybe Jupiter maybe switching teams to some degree, going back into Aries. Not that Jupiter in Aries is always working on behalf of the patriarchy, right? But when Jupiter's in Taurus, it's working for Venus, right? It's working on behalf of Venus. And while it would be rather narrow-minded or an oversimplification of what Taurus is about, and what Venus is about, but Venus traditionally signified women and women's issues, if you will. But I think you could say that Taurus is a sign that, among other things, is dealing with and supporting issues that often pertain to women and people with wombs. It's a little more specifically in Cancer, where like the emphasis on reproduction, the gestation and growing babies in your bed and your body is a little more specifically rooted in Cancer. But Taurus is the exaltation of the moon. So topics related to reproductive health. Jupiter is going to try to advocate for coherent policy around issues pertaining to reproductive health. I think many of us could agree that some coherence is much needed in that sphere these days. So hopefully something to look forward to with Jupiter and Taurus. But anyway, with Jupiter and Taurus, you don't always get like the big events like women's suffrage in the United States, at least. I believe it was established in New Zealand during Jupiter and Taurus. But you do find a lot of like major benchmarks and points of important progress around women's rights, civil rights. In 1917, while Jupiter was still in Taurus, you get the first female member of the U.S. House of Representatives, Jeanette Rankin, which is actually before women's suffrage was even established. Important benchmark, I would say. You also get things like the first female officer in the U.S. Navy, right, when Jupiter's in Taurus. 1928, you get the British Parliament reducing the age that women could vote to be the same as men. So not the big thing, but like the progress towards more equal. Things like the first women's Olympic track event in 1928, first female British cabinet minister. 1952, women get the right to vote in Greece. You even get the first first ever televised birth. What was that? 1952. Jupiter was in Taurus, which as well as the first acknowledged pregnancy on TV on I Love Lucy, which is notable just in advancing the like normalization of things like pregnancy and childbirth, where it's not like some gross thing that women deal with that we don't acknowledge on TV, right? Bringing those topics around, not just like women specifically, but sexuality, bringing those topics into a more balanced and cohesive relationship with culture as a whole, in this case in the United States. You actually had the first successful sexual reassignment operation when Jupiter's in Taurus in 1958. And I could go on and on about the specifics here, but I think you get the point. Jupiter in Taurus seems to bring, his wise counsel and sort of bird's eye perspective on the topic of sexuality and, supporting the enjoyment of pleasurable activities of all kinds, but sex being one of them. I know that Scorpio, right, gets this reputation for being the sexiest sign of the zodiac, right? And I'm often kind of surprised at how rarely Taurus gets brought up in that discussion. But come on, guys. No one knows how to... no sign is more about the enjoyment of sensual physical experiences than Taurus, right? You get a lot of the first sex education programs and even developments in sex education when Jupiter's in Taurus. But the other things you'll see with Jupiter and Taurus, too, is a lot of advancement in the film industry, which kind of surprised me. I had always kind of associated film, specifically in photography, with Neptune, which, may well be the case. I can't pin all advancements in film on Jupiter and Taurus. However, you do see a lot of the big advancements in film and entertainment being introduced when Jupiter is in Taurus. Let's see, not to turn this into a giant reading off of dates, but the first demonstration of color television transmission, 1928, when Jupiter was in Taurus. The first all-talking motion picture shows in New York, 1928, Jupiter's in Taurus. They called them talkies, right? But the first movies with sound, with people talking in them, other than sound other than just like music that was played over the backdrop of a silent film. I would call that a pretty significant advancement in cinema and entertainment in general. The first ever TV drama was broadcast in the New York area. It was called The Queen's Messenger. You get the patent on the iconoscope TV system, right? This like introduction of things that will eventually be staples in a lot of it, specifically in like television and film, but in entertainment in general. Those things come a lot with like jazz and sort of big movements in music and genre formation. See that with Jupiter and Taurus. But you also get the first regularly scheduled TV broadcasts 3 nights a week. First all-color talking picture as well, on the tail end of Jupiter and Taurus in 1929. With music, Billboard publishes the first singles record chart in 1940, Jupiter and Taurus, which is actually, very Jupiter and Taurus. It's not necessarily the art itself, because Jupiter by itself isn't really an artiste, right? It's becomes relevant to art and has an interesting way of operating within the sphere of art when it's in Taurus. But it's a publication that is distributed to expose people, right, to new music, to the best music, right, to broaden their worldview and introduce them to high quality music, the best. Also, it just became a standard for musicians, like to get on on the Billboard, on the top 100, exposes people to you, and is usually a big boon to a musician's career. It's, in the ways that Jupiter supports the arts in Taurus. And you're gonna have to indulge me because I just found the TV stuff so interesting. 1952, I Love Lucy, the famous episode with the Vita Mita Vegemin, whatever, when she does a TV commercial that premieres in Jupiter's and Taurus, and it gets 68% of U.S. television viewers, which is a big deal at the time. Soap operas starting to move from radio into television, which actually is kind of a funny Jupiter and Taurus to some degree. Soap opera, where it's, not to introduce too much of my own opinion about soap operas, but there's a bit of overacting that takes place with soap operas to heighten the drama a little bit. It seems a little more Jupiter and Taurus than Venus, right? Venus is a little more balanced, but I don't know. That could just be an opinion. Closed circuit pay TV telecasts of sports events. First one, Jupiter and Taurus. Was that 1952. Another TV staple, right? Like pay-per-view. The origins of pay-per-view. The first ultra high frequency television station. First video recording on magnetic tape. Like first tape. First 3D feature film premiered during Jupiter and Taurus. I'll stop because it does go on. A lot of big firsts in sort of major benchmarks in the quality of film. I didn't get as far into like when DVDs first came out or when Blu-rays first came out. That would be interesting to look at. Wonder if the first like flat screen might have been Jupiter and Taurus. I don't know, but strong themes, and I think it'd be interesting to see what advancements we might encounter in terms of film, in terms of cinema. Usually good years for movies in general, or even just TV. But interesting theme around animation as well. A lot of the beloved cartoon characters that we all know and love introduced during Jupiter and Taurus. Mickey Mouse, Popeye, Bugs Bunny, Woody Woodpecker, all made their debut either in comics or in animated film, right, during Jupiter and Taurus. Actually, Jupiter and Taurus shows up in the charts of a lot of prominent animators as well, which is interesting. I don't know why, if I would directly link it to animation specifically, but I can tell you, maybe just as a Jupiter and Taurus native myself, much of my teenage years were spent nurturing an ambition to become an animator. I made little animations, published them on the internet, wanted to make animation for a living, and still love animation. So if you have thoughts on why Jupiter in particular might be relevant to the topic of animation, I haven't quite put it together in my head, but if you have, please share it with me personally or in the show, in the comments. I would love to hear it. TV Guide, first issue of the TV Guide. It's published under Jupiter and Taurus, their entertainment fixture. Now, I've probably gone on about this a little too long. I'm going to move on. But you do see a general support and maybe elevation of art forms with Jupiter and Taurus. Jupiter has that quality of trying to elevate things a little more than Venus does. Venus is a little better at meeting you where you're at. And Jupiter can do that too, but it it's a sky god. It's uplifting in nature. So when Jupiter comes to Taurus and starts, playing with the idea of art, it's a little less focused on the aesthetic appreciation than, say, Venus is, which is, art for the sake of just delivering you a beautiful experience. Jupiter wants to deliver you, an aesthetically pleasing an experience in Jupiter, in Taurus, but also wants to deliver a message of some kind, deliver a meaningful statement through art, which I will probably get a lot more in depth with that topic when I go through Jupiter in each of the 3 decans of Taurus, which I'll be publishing on Patreon sometime in the next few weeks. But definitely some interesting stuff comes up with Jupiter in Taurus and artists. It can be a little bit of an art snob sometimes. Again, it's a little high-minded to be like an immediate natural fit in Taurus. However, as just a general placement, and this would apply to many things outside of art, but Jupiter, if you are an artist and you have Jupiter in Taurus, or you are going through a transit with Jupiter in Taurus, look at what house that's in for you, because Jupiter often looks like a benefactor, a patron of some kind, somebody who wants to open doors for you. And Jupiter in Taurus is going to be interested in creating opportunities for artists. So maybe keep an eye out if you're trying to get your art out to a broader audience, right? Jupiter. Now, I think we've covered pretty reasonably some of the ways that Jupiter lends his particular skill set, his manner of bestowing beneficence on the topics and interests of Taurus, right? Of working as an agent on Venus's behalf. But I want to shift focus a little bit, which might be a subtle shift, but I think a relevant one. When you're dealing with any planet in a sign other than its own, it has to be a little more creative with how it attends to its own interests, right? To some degree, it has to sort of work for or under the law of the planet that it's in, the sign that it's in, and the ruling planet of that sign. But it's still, it has its own houses, its own signs to take care of, and its own just general interests, things that the planet wants to do. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the more strictly, some of the ways that Jupiter approaches doing the things that it wants to do when it's in Taurus. And one of those things is, broadly speaking, the idea of like religion or spirituality. One of the signs that Jupiter rules is Pisces, right? So part of Jupiter's sphere of operation is creating that connection between our physical embodied world and that which is unseen, which lies beyond, the scope of the veil, or which lies beyond the visible, the concretely knowable, the eternal and divine, right? That's the Pisces stuff. And while Jupiter has a better aspect with Pisces from sign of Taurus than it does with Sagittarius, Taurus is an aversion to Sagittarius. Doesn't have any kind of aspect with Sag. So it's a lot more alienated maybe to Sagittarius to some degree. It has a sextile with Pisces. So we'll tend to have an easier time working with planets maybe in Pisces, cooperating with them. And there's just a little more commonality between Taurus and Pisces. They're both, more sensually oriented, a little more embodied, a little more felt, and contemplative. They're nocturnal signs. I don't always like the word passive, but there's a more of a sitting back and observing a little more than actively trying to shift and change everything around you. Like Sagittarius is fire, right? When fire is introduced to something, it changes it irrevocably for the most part. Fire transforms it, turns, most things to carbon. But, if you cook something, it totally changes the molecular structure of that item, and you can't reverse it. It's the nature of fire, right? But with earth and water, there's more of an acclimating to what is, or just dealing with what is, maybe reshaping it. But so you'll see Jupiter and Taurus in general when it's trying to build a worldview, create a sense of meaning to answer those big questions of why, what does it all mean? Why are we here? Is there a God? Or are there gods? And what is my relationship with them? Or what is my relationship with the world at large, the world that exists around me that is bigger than me? And how can I connect to it and expand into it, right? So, Jupiter's primary actions, right? It's always trying to do those things. And a lot of what Jupiter in Taurus is very good at is observing things and coming to an understanding with the way things are, the state of things as they are, the state of the material world that can be seen and felt and tasted and touched. Brings that eagle eye to those topics, which, while not inherently the sort of interests that Jupiter is naturally inclined to, it wants to be more upward looking. The focus, you could almost say, is a little more downward, right? It's encountering an inherent sort of maybe limitation. Earth is just not as flexible and changeable as water, and is not as reliable or as rapidly effectacious a instrument of delivering a grand vision, right? With as fire, or creating change as fire. Earth is heavy. It is downward in orientation. It settles. It's at the bottom, right? Which, Earth kind of comes with that quality of it's not as inherently prone to rise in station as maybe fire signs or air signs are. Because, well, just think of Taurus. It likes to be comfortable. It doesn't. Taurus planets aren't as interested, maybe, in rising in station in the same way. There's a lot of ambition in Earth signs in general and in Taurus, but say in Taurus, you don't climb to the top of the hierarchy, maybe in the Shire, by making a lot of noise and making a big splash. In fact, in the Shire, there isn't a really notable hierarchy. Maybe you could be Bilbo Baggins and be kind of famous throughout the Shire, but for the most part, you're still kind of just chilling and doing the things that Bilbo Baggins likes to do. But regardless, we can say that Jupiter's going to still apply that focus to those topics of Taurus, but there's some obvious maybe limitation, right? It's often hard for people with Jupiter and Taurus to see beyond the material. Jupiter in Sag has access to that divine fire, that connection to the godly source, that inspiration that comes from some place unknown, and I just know that this is the path that I must follow, right? That's Jupiter in Sag. Jupiter in Pisces is, feels that connection with the ineffable, the eternal, with the beyond. It's kind of always keeping one foot in the material and another in the unseen, and trying to be the bridge, be the connection between those two places. In Taurus, Jupiter can only kind of see what's around it, and is going to still look for connection, right, to the divine, if you will. I mean, you can even hear Jupiter and Taurus native, and I can't say words like the divine with a straight face. Not that spirituality is not possible with Jupiter and Taurus, or not even a desired thing. It's definitely a desired thing. It's just that Jupiter's going to look for evidence of it in the material, in lived experience, in what it can see, what it can feel and taste. It's a little hard to internalize a sense of knowing that a higher power exists beyond what we can see, because it just doesn't quite have, it's a little too grounded to have access in the same way. So you will see more skepticism with Earth Jupiters in general. Say that Jupiter and Taurus is a little, not necessarily less skeptical, probably a little less skeptical, and maybe a little less concerned about it on its own as just a Jupiter, because there's plenty of things, beautiful things in the material world that can make life enjoyable, a little more meaningful. But there's often a sense of missing something, missing that connection that Jupiter wants. And that is, sometimes you'll see the recreation of of that connection through acts in physical space, or trying to find it through things like art, but that's not going to be everybody. But almost like building a philosophy, building a sense of connection to the divine through the daily rhythm of life. It's like a nature worship, or even an animism, sense that divine essence is right here, right? It's in everything around us. When working well, it can find the divine in the material. He understands that the material is potentially just as divine as all that highfalutin fire shit up in the sky. It'll try to bring that sense of elevation to activities that say Venus and Taurus isn't trying to necessarily incorporate the Mexican food that she ordered, the awesome movie that she watched, the amazing sex that she had into like a grand narrative about what it means to exist, in the same way that Jupiter is maybe trying to do that. So you can get interesting results, obviously, trying to create that in the physical space. But, it's obviously just not the easiest, right? And you can imagine maybe Gandalf, after he spent so much time in the Shire, maybe getting bummed out, missing his wizard friends, missing access to his wizard things and whatever the cool wizard shit is that they have elsewhere. Maybe he gets bummed out that the Shire folk don't want to do magic with them, or maybe only a few of them do, and they aren't that great at it. I don't know. And that can be a bit of a bummer, right? But you can also see maybe a Gandalf that gets so wrapped up in Shire life that he forgets his wizarding ways. He loses some of the magic that he had when he was doing whatever the fuck wizards do in the rest of Middle-earth. So you'll sometimes see some difficulty in sort of soul-searching, or sometimes you'll see just a focus on life as it is rather than even trying to search for that stuff. That's one thing I've seen Jupiter and Taurus a lot in athletes, and particularly, I guess, martial artists, because I've looked at a lot of martial artist charts, but athletes in general, which is interesting, because it wasn't immediately obvious to me maybe why that might be, but a lot of being an athlete is really building your life around the pursuit of achievement in whatever sport you're doing, which means devoting everything to that, to being the best, to being amazing. And there's whole routines you build out of it, and diet plans and exercise plans, so that pouring your essence into an elevated thing maybe goes into a very physical embodied activity, and maybe the gaining of mastery over doing something really awesome. Martial arts is easier for me, where really amazing martial artists are magnificent to watch. They're artists, for a reason. They also they're sculptors of themselves. They're sculpting themselves out of their own bodies, right? They're, not necessarily bodybuilders, but they're, it's like doing the Sag thing, which is bringing everything together towards a unified purpose, that becomes more embodied when Jupiter's in Taurus, where it's bringing everything that I am in my whole life around, not as much an ideal, but a thing that can be seen and witnessed. Creating a body of work, maybe in academia, or maybe in really any profession or activity, but that wanting to accumulate evidence of accomplishment that can be seen. I made this, or I built this, or I got this result with this person. And look, you can see testimony to all these things that I've accomplished, that I've done, or evidence of the ways that I've made this thing or that thing or whatever a better place, that I've grown it and cultivated it over time. Because the expanding into the world does not happen fast with Jupiter and Taurus. It's a slow Jupiter. It doesn't launch at the speed of an arrow into the sky. It launches at the speed of a corn stalk growing out of the ground, right? It's not super fast, but it does tend to be sustainable. It's just a little slower than maybe we would want when it's in Taurus. But I wanted to say a little bit more about just philosophy specifically and spirituality, because you get some interesting results. And one in particular that I want to share. One example, say, of maybe somebody who left the strong imprint of Jupiter and Taurus's philosophy in their work in the world, specifically within the topic of philosophy or spirituality, is Baruch Spinoza. He's a 17th century writer, philosopher, maybe theologian, though I don't know if you would call him that specifically. And with his birth chart, it's C-rated, so we don't know how reliable the birth time is. But we do get an Aries rising, which, whether it's Aries rising or not, it may not seem like Jupiter is particularly potent from the second house, second whole sign house. It's not a particularly visible house. It's kind of under the Earth. If you're using, maybe a Placidius house system, Jupiter would be in the first, but Jupiter's not really ruling an angle on the chart if it's Aries rising. But what Jupiter is doing is ruling a big old stack of Sagittarius planets. And if it's Aries rising, it's in the 9th house, so those Sag planets. So while maybe you're seeing the Sag planets, right, you're seeing the philosophy happening, the mutable fire, or maybe the substance or topics of that fire that are being woven together into a cohesive narrative, and he's forming a decisive, conclusive opinion about, what the fuck the world is. That is all being delivered via Jupiter and Taurus. Jupiter and Taurus is delivering that stuff to the Sag planets. So while the Sag planets may speak louder because there's so many of them, that Jupiter, kind of wherever it is in the chart, is going to have a lot of say in Spinoza's life, in his work, because it rules so many planets in his chart. And you can really see the signature of Jupiter and Taurus in the subject matter of his philosophy. Jupiter and Taurus isn't necessarily going to do the kind of things that Spinoza did on his own, make his life about philosophy and writing and explaining the entirety of the world and creation by itself, but the Sag planets want to do that, and they have to talk to Jupiter to get their ideas. And there's even a mutual reception between Venus and Jupiter. Venus is in Sagittarius, Jupiter's in Taurus, so they're swapping signs. So even without the aspect, there's communication going on. So with Baruch Spinoza, he's a Dutch gentleman born, in a Jewish community in the Netherlands, and he was actually excommunicated. While we don't know specifically why, most likely because of some of the ideas that he, ended up writing about. They were a little controversial, but they were upsetting enough to the Jewish community to boot him out. But he didn't, convert to Catholicism or any other religion, and instead he wrote extensively about his ideas that can probably be most accurately described in modern terms as a sort of pantheism, or maybe animism, where he basically posited that God is not a being. Like there is no personage of God, the way that most religions at the time, and to a large degree to this day, tend to want to construct God as like this other higher, greater being outside of us. Rather, he saw God as everything, and everything as God. That the natural world, nature itself, was God. And then, in a sense, we were all God as well. And that the best thing you can do to live a happy life was to connect and live harmoniously with nature, with natural law, because that, in fact, was God. That, in fact, was divine, or is, according to his worldview. And as you can imagine, 17th century Europe, not the most receptive to his ideas. However, he continues to be very influential now. There's actually it's quite a few adherents in the modern world, and his ideas are a lot more compatible with a lot of modern takes on religion. He was a little bit deterministic in his belief system. The idea of free will was kind of silly or arbitrary, or even the idea of praying to a god was kind of ridiculous to him because, in a sense, what you're doing when you're praying to a god is asking for intervention. You're asking for God to take a special favor upon you to change the natural laws as they are, because according to Spinoza, they are everything that's happening, everything that is a product of nature and natural law is God. So why would a god contradict itself by making special exceptions for individuals? So I mean, I'm not a philosopher or Spinoza expert. It's sort of the gist, but I think you can see the pretty strong signature of Jupiter and Taurus on what those Sagittarius planets are espousing to the world. And he had a lot of other ideas, about money and living a good life, not taking too much, not being too greedy, blah-de-blah-de-blah. You can read about Spinoza yourself or watch a YouTube video about it. I'm sure there are plenty. But you can see how Spinoza, with Jupiter and Taurus, wasn't trying necessarily to look beyond the world as it was to find God. He found it around him every day, in every moment, in every person and every object, which, while you could say is not very spiritual, maybe, or very elevating, I don't know, I think that's kind of awesome. Like, that it's all just right here. You don't have to go on a big quest. You don't have to go to a church. You don't have to go through a bunch of rituals, make a bunch of sacrifices. You just have to live and observe the world around you, and you're chilling with God, right? You're in heaven, because everything that is divine, right? Yeah, interesting guy, interesting philosophy. Definitely check him out. But I'll set Spinoza aside for now. I'll probably end up discussing him more in depth in the exploration of Jupiter through the decans, but I want to wrap things up here because I know that this video has got to be well beyond the hour marker at this point. But I'll wrap things up with a theme I encountered that kind of surprised me, that took me a while to figure out why this theme was so loud and prominent in charts of people with Jupiter and Taurus. And that's in part why this video is not being released on the day of the ingress, because I had to sit with it for a while, because it was too loud to ignore, but I didn't get it until now. And that is this theme around the study of language, of linguistics, that just came up over and over and over again with Jupiter and Taurus. So maybe to clarify a little bit, this isn't the study of like many languages in order to be proficient in speaking languages with lots of people necessarily. This is the study of the structure of language. Essentially, it showed up in different ways. It was a lot of linguistic anthropologists, linguistic philosophers, but just over and over and over again, chart after chart, Jupiter and Taurus, of people for whom the study of language and linguistics was a key component of their work in the world. Such a loud theme, right? And the reason that I struggled with it was because, language, Mercury, right? The idea of conveying information through the medium of symbolic sounds, right? It's Mercury, and seems like intuitively like the understanding of language as a whole would be more of like a Mercury-Jupiter thing. What does language mean? What does it mean to have language? However, after I spent time thinking about it and spent a little more time with the work of some of the Jupiter and Taurus linguistic experts, it started to make more and more sense to me. And probably the big part of it is that the focus on language, it's understanding the role of language in terms of defining culture. Linguistic anthropology specifically, which I flirted with briefly in college with majoring in, is essentially that. It's the study of the role that language has in defining cultural groups, even how it defines the way cultures construct ideas or perceive the world and interact with the world and perceive others and each other, which is very Venus-Jupiter Well, I mean, in general, it's very Jupiter, where you are going to tend to see that larger scale unification rather than Venus's more interpersonal unification. But where the real substance of that large scale unification takes place is in the individual exchanges between people, and how do we do that? Through language. And I'm going to focus a little bit just on Noam Chomsky, largely because he's the kind of the loudest example, the most clear example, but also probably the most well-known Jupiter and Taurus linguist. And that's, if you're not familiar with Noam Chomsky, he is a professor of linguistics. He's been around for a long time. If you look him up on YouTube, you'll find interviews with him from the 70s, maybe earlier. And he's got I'll pull up his chart. He's a Sagittarius rising with a big old stack of planets in Sagittarius, which, while Jupiter in Taurus it rules his ascendant, is not particularly loud by itself from the sixth house. Again, kind of like Spinoza, we have a bunch of Sagittarius planets in a much more prominent position who are looking to Jupiter for all the ideas and truths that want to be expressed through the Sagittarius planets. Those are all coming from Jupiter in Taurus. And so essentially Noam Chomsky, his expertise and sort of title, you could say, is professor of linguistics. He's written about, taught, and sort of based his life and studies on the study of language and understanding, the ins and outs of language, and even what the limits are of what we actually know about language, or how it works and what it does, and what it even is. But a lot of what he's known for isn't even about linguistics at all, is because he sort of used that understanding of language as maybe sort of a baseline or springboard for an understanding of just how people work, or how societies work, and how cultures work. And more notably with probably his most well-known work, his book, Manufacturing Consent, which I couldn't even begin to explain, but it basically, he breaks down how, capitalism works in American society and in, the Western culture in general, and just in the world system. What is the state of the world and the people's relationships with each other, and how does the flow of goods and, consumption and demand, greed and power, how do all those things kind of come together to define, the state of how things are and how things work. And I highly recommend Manufacturing Consent. It had a big role to play in what made me want to study linguistics back when I was in college. But I just want to maybe refer to some of his ideas about language to maybe help highlight why, help illustrate why this is Jupiter, right? Jupiter and Taurus. When you listen to Noam Chomsky talk about what language is, especially earlier on, he's kind of like, we can't even define what language is. We couldn't even define what a word is. Rather than it being a thing, it's he kind of sees it as a just sort of function of biology, just something internal and instinctive in humans. Because, if you were to try to explain what a word is to a being that didn't have the capacity to understand human language, it would be just an impossible thing to do. You would need words to explain what the words mean. And that take on language is interesting because it sort of takes our understanding away from the mercurial, in a sense, that sort of, this means this, this means this, this means this. It's still that, it's still, that's a component, and we'll explore maybe the mercurial component a bit more in the decans, but his sort of construction of language is this much more organic thing, or the conception of language is this much more organic thing that just sort of is, and is constantly evolving, and is actually quite impossible to define. It's not really a category. The Spanish language, when you really examine, Spanish as a language, the actual composition of the body of people who say that they speak Spanish probably speak a lot of different versions of Spanish, and there's kind of blurry lines around where Spanish ends and maybe some other languages begin, but it's also a constantly evolving and changing thing. What is Spanish today is different from Spanish 100 years ago. And granted, he's got a Mercury that's doing a thing in his chart, which I won't dive into, but this goes beyond just Noam Chomsky. He just kind of did it the mostest. This idea of language as an organic process that is sort of a product of the growth of the brain. And it is a thing that you can see and experience, but it's also a thing that changes all the time. And it's also the thing that creates harmony between people, that creates understanding. Because if you share a common set of symbols with another person, you can talk to them and pretty reliably assume that they're going to understand you. And you can come to accord easily. But, if you're talking to somebody who has a different set of symbols or a different conception behind what the same sound or same gesture is supposed to mean, it's very easy to offend each other and thus create conflict. It's maybe why the Shire folk, right? They like the hobbits they like home because everybody's familiar, speaks the same language, and they don't want to leave because outside is where, people aren't necessarily going to understand them. And even other people coming outside, bringing in new ideas, shaking things up, that's like an uneasy thing in the Shire, in Taurus land. But even just getting away from the Shire thing, it's a kind of a function of just how people work in terms of the way cultures develop in order to kind of facilitate these harmonious exchanges between individuals and both in larger groups. I think what makes sense about it to me is that when you're getting into the real nitty-gritty of language, it's hard to pull apart the Jupiter from the Venus. So you're really getting into territory that they both deal with rather extensively. I'll have to see what other placements might correspond to the study of linguistics outside of Jupiter and Taurus, because I'm sure it's not the sole domain of Jupiter and Taurus, but it's an interesting theme. But one of the things Noam Chomsky said about language, and I'm paraphrasing it because it was a lengthy statement, but it was more or less that language represents the cultural wealth of a people. Much of culture is a sort of playing games with language and creating elaborate kinship systems, most of which have little functional utility. But it's just the creative mind at work. So it's kind of, I don't know, like language is sort of this, rather than it being a sort of rigid and categorical thing, like maybe with Mercury, it's something that's always in flux, and it's kind of this creative act. But he also talked about how language systems define the kind of art that you can do. We build expectations around aesthetic forms and ideals through language, and we rely on those sort of structures and systems to create art. I think the way he explained it is like, we don't write poems as just sort of a bunch of words thrown on the page. There's a format. There's like this many syllables, this many words. These, need to sound the same, similar in this parts. There's structure and form that we all sort of follow that supports the art, but also, inhibits the art to some degree too. But the art is basically, a product of culture, of that sort of big human soup. And language just ends up being a way for Jupiter to address and focus on maybe the subtle but foundational components of life. If you understand language and how it works, you understand how essentially people work. You understand, the coding that people are operating with, and the sorts of things that make them tick, and the sorts of things that make them do this or that. And with that information, you can potentially teach people a better way, or become aware of both how we maintain cohesiveness as a society for good and bad, but also how we might cultivate a better way. We can look at Jupiter and Taurus and see a planet that has no diggity, not much to work with, just kind of awkward, and Gandalf romping around the Shire, kind of out of place. But applying Jupiter to something that it's not necessarily super comfortable with, you can kind of see how there might be some utility in that. Something may be special about that. Because while you can, in Sagittarius, weave a very coherent belief system and inspire people and galvanize, action, create more sort of big movements in society geared towards a specific outcome, launching the arrow, right? Hitting the target. Jupiter in Taurus has maybe a capacity to examine life and human nature from a kind of ground level up, sort of a capacity to understand human in their natural habitat. I guess it's all the Earth signs have a way of relating to sort of an environmental, physical, material, embodied way of relating to the world. But with Jupiter or with Taurus, you're maybe looking at the carrots, right? The things that people just do because it feels comfortable and it feels good, because they are attracted to it. They're drawn to it, A bee is always going to be drawn to flowers. Does the bee know why? I don't know. Maybe. We don't really know, but presumably the bee just, smells the flower, smells good, gathers its the nectar, whatever, from the flower, and brings it back to the hive, because that's what feels good and natural to the bee. But the bee doesn't necessarily realize it's also part of this bigger process. It's not really thinking necessarily about the pollen that it's getting on it and dropping off at other flowers, And the bee doesn't necessarily need to know that. The bee will likely continue to do that, whether it knows it or not. But if you're, a conscious bee looking out for the interests of all of bee kind, and you're able to identify ways in which those patterns for the bees are problematic, or you want to, level up bees' place in the world, you want to maybe harness some of those instincts, understand them so that you can direct them towards other activities, perhaps, or like with people and language, right? If we spend enough time with these kind of fundamental structures, well, the kind of changes you might make with that information aren't the big, make a big immediate splash in the world, but rather like if you were to select certain plants in your garden for replanting, right? Which I believe I've heard that it's often said that corn is the first genetically modified food, not because, we injected it with artificial DNA, but because we selected it over thousands of years, and the corn that we have today is nothing like the corn that we had thousands of years ago, and I think even hundreds of years ago. Similar with bananas too, right? But you don't see those changes immediately, right? You gotta plant those specially selected seeds, let the next crop grow, and then select some from that one and let those grow. And over a long period of time, you get something that is fundamentally different, like structurally, like at its being, on a material, physical level, that has its own, inherent value. I don't think that's something that you can quite do in the same way with Jupiter, or maybe in a fire sign, or maybe in a exalted or dignified in a water sign, or, So I think that's maybe one way to approach Jupiter and Taurus if you have it in your birth chart, is understanding that that's the kind of way that your Jupiter works. It's going to work slow. It's going to work subtle, but more foundational, more fundamental. This is, changing your diet, establishing a more coherent routine, right? That supports your body, which, after you get enough sleep, after you've eaten enough salad and laid off the potato chips for a few weeks, you start to feel really good. And yeah, your life is different, not in a big visible way, but in a fundamental and subtle way that makes it possible for you to change your life in bigger ways from that point. It sort of starts from that level. And if you're looking at Jupiter, as transiting in a particular part of your chart, Jupiter's here to help, but that's the kind of help that Jupiter maybe has to offer, which may not be the manna from heaven that we're like hoping for with Jupiter. Jupiter's not going to, fly in with a cape or with a big, motivational speech, galvanize you to action like it did in Aries. It's going to maybe examine your life or help you examine your life, that area of your life, and pay attention to the subtle but foundational elements of it, and how some small tweaks here and a couple of tweaks here might result in a much more sustainable, smoother running, happier little mini Shire, in that part of your life. And, stop and appreciate what's just good about what is, you know? I think Jupiter and Taurus can maybe help bring our attention a little more towards appreciating what may already be an existing feature of our life that when we're caught up in the rapid pace of things, we don't really get a chance to stop and enjoy. There may be a lot of wisdom to be gained from simplifying things, slowing down, appreciating what is and what you have, and maybe not feeding parts of your life that you don't want, right? You know, if you have weeds growing in your garden, you don't put Miracle Grow on those parts. You don't put Miracle Grow on the weed patches, right? You put it on the areas of the garden you want to grow. You poison the weeds, right? or you know, maybe you just ignore them and maybe they go away. I don't know. I'm not a gardener, to be honest with you, but point being, there's a lot to be said for just feeding the parts of your life that you do like so that they get bigger and stronger, and just not feeding the stuff you don't like so much. You know, be stubborn. Be a stubborn Jupiter. And just do the things that you like, and you'll probably get more of them. And yeah, with that, I'm done. I am cutting myself off. I'm gonna wrap it up for today. Be sure to check out Patreon that is launching May 22nd. Find more lengthy versions of some of the planet and sign videos that I've done recently, where we explore in depth the decans, the planets in each of the 10 degree subdivisions of the signs, which give you a real deeper understanding of the different ways that a planet can express itself in one sign. You know, you can see how big of a difference these decans actually make, but it also helps understand just what the nature of the sign is as a whole, of the planet in the sign as a whole, by understanding its parts more thoroughly. It's easier to understand a car as a holistic object when you know how its engine works, if you're into that sort of thing. Except it's not cars, it's astrology. So if you want to get into the mechanics, get covered in oil and grease with astrology, check out the Patreon. And if you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe. You can book a reading with me through my website, KylePierceAstrologer.com. We can get our hands dirty and greasy, sort of take apart and put back together your chart. And if you happen to be going to attending NORWAC this May of 2023, thanks to a rather unexpected and very generous scholarship that I won through ESAR, I will be attending this year. Very excited. But if you happen to be going, don't hesitate to say hello. You know, this is my Jupiter return, so I want to expand my world and meet new people. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching, for commenting, subscribing, all that stuff. It really means the world to me, even if I wasn't clever enough in the moment of me reading your comment for me to come up with a response, or if I was busy or something. I am interested, and I love hearing what you all have to say. So with that, calling it a night. Happy Jupiter and Taurus, and see you next time.